Hello and welcome, fellow motorsports fans. I'm finally back. Sorry for skipping 2 weeks of very important racing action, but unfortunately I was both busy and ill, and it was just a bit of an awful combination. But nonetheless, we are finally back, and I couldn't really have picked a better week because there was, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, 10 different single-seater series all competing on one weekend. Now, naturally, that is a little bit too much, even for me, but we will go through all the different highlights, including all the madness in the feeders, and almost most importantly for me, the newest drama in IndyCar. But let's not waste any more time, and as is tradition, we start in F4. Now, I'll have to group these together in a bit of a weird way this time around, just so we don't have 10 different chapters, but we will begin with Euro Formula Open, which has finally started its season. And at this point, honestly, I'm just glad that we do have a season at all. This is really the main story with Euro Formula Open, the sort of weak nature of the current grid, but nonetheless, it does feature some, at the very least, interesting figures. So, number one, Lorenzo Pourchaire suddenly deciding that he will actually do single-seaters on the side next to his ELMS occupation, which I find a very bizarre career choice, to be honest. I also think he is a tad overqualified for the series, at least combined with the fact that we know he has money to do something better as well. So I don't really know why he's doing what he's doing, but nonetheless, I think he will be one of the championship favorites, and during this first weekend at least, he was the fastest of the guys, even if it didn't exactly end with all the wins he could have gotten. The other guy who's like the big X factor is Simonazzi, who obviously probably shouldn't be in this series. By all accounts, he's a bit too good for it, but yeah, if he can't afford to step up, BVM keeps giving him this seat, so fair enough, that's who we've got. He is the one contender to go up against the Motor Park army, really. The only other story I want to touch on here is like the sad part of this series, aside from the weak grid, and that's Jacob Bergmeister, who I had hoped he could step up another level now that it's his second year in this particular series as well, not just in car racing. So in theory, he should have a leg up on some of his competition just by being used to the car and the tracks, even if he's still not super experienced all around, of course. But unfortunately, he is still like very clearly the worst of the guys, and only really rivaled by Barrichello, who, I mean, we know he's not the quickest guy ever. So bit of a sad one. Nonetheless, we'll keep watching the championship, but it really will come down to Pourchaire versus Benavides and some Simonazzi if the car allows. It's an odd one. The other F4 series we have to touch on, aside from GB4, we'll definitely get to that, is the, in my mind, it's a Czech F4, but obviously it's a Central European Zone F4. I see the Z, the C and F4, and it's Czech in my mind. Don't ask. Weird one, not the strongest grid once again. It very much reminded me of the Saudi Arabian F4, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, they don't use the one team to run all cars approach, but it is very similar in the fact that we have a few interesting like European names and then a lot of more regional talent, which I just didn't know a whole lot about, and I'm interested to just see how they do over the course of the season. But as expected, the top dogs are the, you know, the European drivers you'd expect to be at the sharp end here when looking at the entry list. So Ethan Isher, Oscar Wirtz and Kirill Kutzkov are all sort of the three protagonists, and Isher isn't actually scored. I don't really know why, but he's not eligible for the championship for some reasons. So technically this looks like it'll come down to Wirtz versus Kutzkov, depending on how many rounds they actually end up doing and what the PHM guys do once they show up. The regional talent, a bit lackluster at the current stage, I do have to say. There just wasn't, you know, nobody stood out to me like, oh yeah, this guy will definitely be amazing going forward, but there's some potential there for sure. The guys weren't awfully slow by any stretch. In fact, the midfield was still pretty compact, which in this series isn't guaranteed by any means, so that was quite good. And yeah, I am looking forward to see how this develops further. Now, there was other F4 series that we could touch on here, but unfortunately they weren't streamed or not accessible for me personally. So that's one, the Nordic 4, which please let me know in the comments, because I know they're not broadcasting all the rounds, only most of them, but I thought I read they were going to broadcast round 1 and then they didn't, or I was too stupid to find it. So in case it's option 2, please let me know down in the comments where I can watch this, because I was quite excited for it actually and thought it was a little sad. And then the other one, British F4, is just unfortunately to this day not accessible outside of the UK, which is a shame, and I really don't know why that's the case. But as always, I will have to wait for them to gradually upload everything on YouTube, so it'll probably be one that I just catch up with during the off season. We will probably, you know, talk about the championship every now and then, but don't expect British F4 to be a centerpiece of this channel just because I literally can't watch it. Now, let's move on to another British F4 series. Time to get to the more exciting part of the weekend, the Silverstone round of both GB4 and GB3. And I have to say, despite only 2 races taking part in both categories because of rain on the Sunday, we still had a few amazing races, and truth be told, I am a little glad they skipped the reverse grid race, even though in a lot of times, I think it was technically the second time slot that got cancelled, but they decided to cancel the reverse grid race and give us 2 proper regular races, which I am all about. So starting in GB4, we had a slightly different look at the sharp end, and I'm very glad to report it's the guys I was already sort of hoping for in round 1, namely Lucio and Finn Harrison, both 2 young British talents. So I was looking forward to see what they can do stepping up to single-seaters, and this time they were at the sharp end. Lucio only in one of the 2, but then again, he's a privateer. He scored a podium as the only privateer entry on the grid, so you know, talk about achievements, that is a pretty good one as far as podiums go. And then Finn Harrison obviously driving in actually a proper car, but that's why he was the sort of protagonist, or one of the protagonists in both races, although the clear-cut #1 guy to watch, and we did speculate after round 1, was Linus Grandforce, who was just absolutely rapid and did essentially dominate both of these races, truth be told. Nonetheless, I want to focus on Lucio versus Harrison for a moment, just so your eyes get some enjoyment as well, because a look at this battle. They were side by side for about a lap, and it was absolutely beautiful to watch. Shows the racecraft these young guys have coming out of karts straight into the big cars, and I mean, second ever race weekend for both, I think. Maybe Harrison raced somewhere and I missed it, but you know, definitely not very experienced. And I mean, just look at this. That's what single-seater racing is all about, isn't it? On the female side of the equation, which obviously is also a big topic in GB4, unfortunately, Alicia Palmowski wasn't quite as relevant as she was during the first round. She wasn't really a front runner and was bogged down a little bit in the midfield at times. So this time, her versus Chloe Grant was actually a proper battle for the position of best female driver on the grid. Nonetheless, I would like to say that Palmowski still proved it's her. It'll be her this season, I think. So yeah, there we go. At least the natural order was restored in that sense, but I still hope to see her fighting for more podiums going forward again. In GB3, actually once again, first of all, a super calm race weekend despite very tricky conditions, which is a rare thing in these single-seaters, which leads me to believe either they are all cowards, which I know isn't true, or they were actually all like very, very competent. Like this was an incredibly well-organized race weekend for this level of racing, if that makes sense. So I was very pleased to watch this, but equally it leaves us with not that many talking points because it was a very standard race weekend. We had Will McIntyre, Kucherek, Cresswell, Sharp, and the debutant Yugo Chukwu sort of all doing really, really well. Then again, they are all in the cars that are supposed to do really well. I guess the biggest talking point is that out of all the one-off guys just doing the Silverstone round, he was by far the most competent one. Then again, he was also by far in the most relevant car compared to Stenson and Wharton, so I don't even really know if we can read too much into this, I don't think. Basically, the best takeaway here is really Yugo will do good come Silverstone in F3, or Frecker for that matter, which they don't visit it, do they? Yeah, so that's why he's doing it here. My brain isn't working right, sorry. So yeah, either way, he'll be good at Silverstone in F3, I think we can assume that. But aside from this, really not many big talking points, aside from the fact that this season will stay tight and intense until the very end, because so far there is nobody at all who's got like a leg up on the rest of the competition, not even for individual races or weekends at this point. So it'll stay a tight one. I want to point out that Barnard has sort of disappeared again to like less relevance to what I would have expected him to be going into the season. So at least my personal prediction would be he'll stay there for most of it. I wouldn't, you know, assume him to be at the sharp end for too much more, but obviously I could be very wrong there. I was before with the first round. Let's go to the American side of racing. Over at Barber in the US, we had 3 different series, part of the IndyCar ladder, all taking place, well, 1 being IndyCar, so I guess 2 being part of the IndyCar ladder and the big series. And the USF Juniors in particular produced 2, yes, pretty chaotic as you would more or less expect, but still meaningful races in the sense that we got Ariel Elkin proving that he will be definitely a front runner in the series. He did pretty much dominate both of these races, so that was quite good, very much a slight step up from the first weekend where he hinted at having that front running pace, and this time he actually converted it. And the other guys, obviously all the youngsters, are still performing reasonably well. Max Taylor sort of more anonymous in this still than he is in the USF 2000s, which is a bit odd, but maybe that's just what he's, you know, putting more time and effort into, I don't know. And then Weldon continues to just be very impressive, got a podium, was a little, you know, a little off in the first race, but just like an overall consistent top midfield to front runner, so, you know, no complaints there whatsoever. For me, really the biggest positive surprise here was that Jack Jaffers, who, you know, certainly should have been on anyone's shortlist for like championship favorite going into this. He was actually back on form this time, got a P2 in the first race. Unfortunately, a wreck early on in the second race, so in terms of the championship run, he is still in a horrible position. Nonetheless, it's just good that he can actually just show his own personal potential as a driver. Unfortunately, we also had a couple of horrific crashes, some of which I'll show you here. And a sad story for me personally is that reigning Brazilian F4 champion Tassaro was actually not competing this round. I mean, I'd presume he doesn't have the funds to do the entire season, which is just, you know, slightly heartbreaking. We talked about him during the first round, how he looked like the better of the Brazilians coming over and, like, you know, very impressive from day one really. So it's a bit of a shame that he's not here. Maybe someone who speaks Portuguese knows a little more about this and could let me know in the comments. I would really appreciate it. Now, IndyNXT continues to be the big show, and for me personally, I love that this is one where already we sort of have the championship mapped out to an extent. It very much looks like we had a repeat of St. Pete with Abel versus Siegel, and this time it was the other way around. Jacob Abel actually controlling the race ahead of Siegel. Then again, unlike Siegel did in the first race, he didn't just drive off into the distance. He was very much under pressure the entire race, did a beautiful job to keep Siegel behind, didn't crack under pressure whatsoever, no mistakes, nothing, just a cleanly executed race to the line for what I believe should be his maiden win. So very good stuff all around, but I still want to point out that Siegel probably still was the fastest car on track throughout the weekend. As always, the good stories typically come with some sad stories along the way, and this one is Jamie Chadwick, and we actually have 2 sides of this particular coin here, because first up, she was on to have her best ever IndyNXT race. I'm not entirely sure in terms of results, but because she did luck into some good positions in the very crash-heavy races last year. But at least in terms of the actual performance and like how merited the result actually would have been, this was clearly her best race so far. She was running in P5, I believe, for most of the race, even scrapping for P4 for like the lead midfield position. Very impressive stuff. Unfortunately then, near the end of the race, first of all, she got shuffled down a little bit. And then more importantly, while side by side with another car, she lost the rear and had a spin and even didn't, yeah, I think she completely wrecked out of the race at that point. So didn't get any result after this impressive of a drive. Obviously not great, but for all the haters and doubters and, oh yeah, she's never going to be quick enough to do anything. Yeah, actually I think she might be. Like, I think my prediction going into the season of she will maybe get like a podium on merit this season at least. I'm feeling pretty good about that prediction right about now. Let me just phrase it this way. And then last but not least for IndyNXT, we had Kaya Colette, who obviously I think we're all familiar with, and at least I rate him quite highly, so I was very happy to see him fighting for a podium. Yes, he didn't actually get it done. He was stuck in P4. He was, much like Siegel, he was also in the same duel all race long, but just didn't get it past row. Nonetheless, also a guy who might throw his name into the championship fight at some point. Last but not least, Louis Foster. Obviously going into this, we would have expected him to be a championship contender, and he will probably still end up being one. I'd at least like to think so. But he had a not so great result, but an amazing drive by charging from dead last all the way through the midfield. I forgot where he finished, but I think it might have actually been P5. If it wasn't, then it was like P6. He was the guy initiating the aforementioned midfield reshuffle that saw Chadwick drop down a little. So, I mean, either way, it doesn't matter if you finish P5 or P6. If you come from P26, I reckon you probably had a pretty good weekend. Now, IndyCar. And this is the one that really deserves more attention than I'm usually giving it, just because the on-track is so much that it's hard to cover in any sort of reasonable degree in the few minutes I have for it every week. But instead of focusing too much on the on-track action, which was largely dictated by Penske just bringing the strongest cars, McLaughlin and Power sort of controlling the race for the most part, there was some interesting scenarios with different strategies playing out, as is usually the case in IndyCar, but at the end of the day, the top two positions never felt too threatened. And Lundqvist got his maiden podium. That was cool, with a nice little charge on the better strategy, but also still had to get some overtakes done, so, you know, had to work for it a little bit. All nice and well, but instead of focusing on the on-track stuff, I think with IndyCar we need to focus on the off-track stuff, because there was two massive stories this weekend. First up, we had the very, very late Penske disqualification from the St. Pete season opener. Well, not Penske entirely. Will Power actually didn't get DQ'd, but both McLaughlin and, crucially, the race winner Joseph Newgarden both got DQ'd like over a month after the race, which probably shouldn't happen. It's not the greatest look for the sport, and everything I've at least read about it, it looks like they didn't actually, it looks like it's a very harsh penalty. Obviously, I get it, you have to penalize cheating, even if it's accidental cheating, which all signs point to. That you do need to have some sort of method in place to deal with that, but maybe a full-on DQ is a little harsh. Maybe there should have been a different system. I don't know, I'm just throwing out ideas here. The other big story is Malukas, who was supposed to run for McLaren this season, but obviously broke his wrist in the off-season with a bike accident. And yeah, he's now officially out of McLaren, which first of all I think is incredibly harsh. There was a lot of people saying it's his own fault. So again, this is where I need you guys. Point me to a credible source that has some more details on the actual accident, because I've only read it was a mountain biking accident, which, listen, obviously it's not the safest pastime, but I'm sure he's done it before. Like, should sport athletes never be allowed to do any other sort of physical activity because they could get injured? I don't know. I still feel like it's very harsh to say he brought this on himself. That's a bit, you know, disgusting if you ask me. But again, everyone's entitled to their opinion. And anyway, the important bit here is not actually that he's out, it's more of who might replace him. And so far, for us Feeder Series fans, two very interesting options with Theo Pourchaire and Callum Ilott, both sort of in that circle just because, well, they've been the drivers replacing him so far. Both have done well, obviously with Ilott, no surprise. Pourchaire has been anonymous, but solid during his first two IndyCar outings, I think is the best way to put it. Like, he hasn't set the world on fire by any stretch, but he didn't bring any attention to himself with being trash either. So I think both would be amazing replacements. Personally, I would love to see Ilott in that seat. I think it's a disgrace that he doesn't have a full-time IndyCar ride this season. But Malukas out, I don't know, it just feels very, very wrong to me. Let me know all of your opinions about this case down in the comments if you have any, because yeah, it's a bit of a tough topic, I think, to actually discuss properly. Now, finally, we got to talk about some electric racing, don't we? Formula E, at Monaco, and I have to say, so far, obviously the entire Formula E season, I was talking about how good is the racing, better in some weekends, pretty trash in others, and that has really been the story of this season for me so far, which sounds a bit odd, but obviously if the on-track action is horrible, it does just take away a little from the results, especially if the on-track action isn't great and the outcome feels random. Like, that's the key difference to F1, where obviously, yes, we do end up with dull races, but then they are really mostly dull because everybody just finishes where they are supposed to finish. In Formula E, you couldn't even say who's supposed to finish where, especially in these like very, very boring, bad to race kind of races. So I am incredibly happy to report that I think this is the best race we've had so far in Formula E this year. And actually, for me personally, like, this is probably what Formula E should look like. I know not everybody will agree with this, so again, very interested in your guys' opinions. But I actually like that it was, we could have overtaking, there was a lot of overtaking despite it being Monaco, but it also wasn't an entirely random train of cars constantly passing and repassing. We had strategy playing out, track position was an important factor, not like one of those afterthoughts like on some tracks, Misano for example 2 weeks ago. So I don't know, for me this was just an incredibly entertaining race. Yes, the front end was settled down a lot more than you'd usually expect in an FE race, but I think actually it contributed to my enjoyment just because, again, it didn't feel random this time. It felt very controlled. Jaguar had the pace, they had the strategy, and they executed it beautifully for like an easy 1-2 finish, as easy as they can be in a spec series. But they made it easy for themselves by just running it this well. So I don't know, for me personally, beautiful to watch. I don't mind the teams being a little more, well, obviously we had a Jaguar 1-2 and a Penske 3-4 and then almost even a Porsche 5-6, so maybe this was a little too structured for some of you. But then again, first of all, incidents definitely contributed to this particular running order, and second of all, again, I think that's probably just where some of these cars should be finishing, and this is also why now the championship looks, you know, solid. Sort of the championship table is what you would kind of expect with like Wehrlein and Cassidy and Roland and Dennis all sort of in there, and a lot of people still have a very good shot at the championship despite like now being halfway into the season. So I don't know, for me personally, I hope we can keep going like this, because if we can, then Formula E will be straight back to being one of the best types of racing out there. As always, one sad story, or well, depressing story if you're a fan of that team, which is the absolute shit show that Envision Racing is at the moment, with both Buemi and Frines getting involved in incidents and just like horrible luck all around. And well, not just luck, especially in Buemi's case, but nonetheless, like this team just can't get anything right at the moment. In this race, the pace was there again. They would have at least been in the points, I think, and then they messed it up themselves. So something needs to change. But for the team, you know, actually taking home the team's championship last season, let's just say they look like an entirely different outfit this time around. Last but not least, the feel-good story for the feeder series guys, as is tradition. Taylor Barnard actually got to give his IndyCar, his Formula E debut, replacing Sam Bird, which that's not great for the championship. Bird got himself injured during practice, so he had to get an emergency replacement. Obviously, Formula E, first of all, probably the worst series to hop into without any preparation, or like just to be a rookie in, just because of how different it is. And yeah, Barnard really didn't have any preparation for obvious reasons. And nonetheless, I think he actually did a very good job. Like, he did what you would expect from a guy in his situation who just wants to make the most of this opportunity. He kept the car out of the wall, something that a lot of his competitors did not manage to do. And yes, in terms of pace, he was basically dead last all race, which perfectly fine. But yeah, just a clean race, just showed that he could at least be an asset for a team, even while he's just learning the pace and everything, which obviously we know Taylor Barnard. I'm sure he would pick up the pace in no time if given the opportunity. And with his McLaren affiliation and his lack of funding, obviously FE not the least likely future for him, you know, so I think this could have been a little glimpse into what we will see in the coming years. Now, that was a ton. I haven't been here for a while, so, you know, hopefully you don't mind me rambling a little bit. Nonetheless, now it's your turn. Aside from the things we've already talked about, let me know your highlights of this week. We need the discussion back in the feeder series world. I've missed this a little. And aside from that, Super Formula Lights was also on, by the way, but yeah, I just didn't have the time to catch up with that, and I'm not a super big Super Formula Lights fan, so I didn't really feel like missing out on much. We might get to it in the future weeks when things calm down a little bit again, but yeah, 10 different series is a tad much, don't you think? And obviously that's not even accounting for start of DTM, MotoGP, and all the other good bits about the racing world. I really need to come up with a better format to squeeze all of this in here somehow. Anyway, that's a me problem, not a you problem. So in your case, I just thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.